Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Really warm welcome to this event being hosted by the Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Centre for International Development. My name is Briony Jones. I'm the Director of WICID, and I want to extend huge thanks to the whole of the WICID team, in fact, and especially to Diane Young, who's been helping to organise this event and put together all the important practicalities. So thank you so much, Diane, who's working with us as a researcher at the moment. We really appreciate your work. So for those of you that don't know, just a quick introduction to WICID. We were established in 2019 as a research centre at the University of Warwick, and our work focuses particularly on global questions of inequality and injustice through a kind of a partnership model where we work with partners across the global south and global north to generate critical research on international development, but also policy and practice oriented outputs through our blogs, our YouTube channel, and our Methods Lab toolkits, among others. If you are interested in joining our network and following our work, please do sign up for our newsletter, and Diane will put the information for that in the chat. But moving on to the event today on liminal transitional justice between the international and the domestic, which is a really exciting panel discussion, not only for WICID, but for me personally, because I'm so interested in the work of all of the panelists and myself work in the field of transitional justice. We're really fortunate to have Mariam Salehi with us from the Free University of Berlin, who's going to be kickstarting our discussion by introducing her recently published book, Transitional Justice in Process, Plans and Politics in Tunisia. And this will really be, in a sense, the intellectual starting point for all of our discussions. And so first we're going to hear from Mariam about some of the key themes she'd like to draw out from the book and to share with us in exchange with the panelists and with the audience as well. So thank you, Mariam, for coming. We'll then have some responses from our other panelists, Jelena Subotic and Oumar, who are also really welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, both well known for their work in this field, on similar themes and topics which Mariam touches upon in her book, which is why we brought everyone together. And so we'll hear from all of the panelists, and then I'd like to moderate, if I may, some exchanges between the panelists, so drawing out some of those kind of key questions and reflections before opening up for questions and comments from the audience. Please do feel free to post your questions in the chat as you have them. And we will certainly try and come to you, still also aiming to finish on time. So without any further ado, Mariam, I invite you to make your opening remarks, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Briony, first of all, for the invitation, and then also for the nice introductory remarks. And I find it really, kind of funny to be introduced as the intellectual starting point here, because I think I draw my intellectual starting points from somewhere else, and I will, I think, draw some connections. Addressing, the themes and the questions we've outlined beforehand about transitional justice between the international and the domestic. I just want to start with saying that when I started doing research on transitional justice in Tunisia, which was in early 2014, so 8 years ago, and that was at a point in time when the Tunisian transitional justice law had just been passed by parliament, but right before the institution, the Truth and Dignity Commission, had started its work. And when I started doing the research and started to talk about my work in academic settings, I was often encountered with two contradicting questions or assumptions. And the first one would be why I would perceive the Tunisian transitional justice process as a topic of concern for those interested in international politics. Right. And the second one would be whether transitional justice would be something that Tunisians cared about at all, or whether it was just not all imposed top down by technocratic and depoliticizing policy interventions of the so-called justice industry. And Jelena's work on high-tech justice, in which she shows how domestic political actors used imposed transitional justice measures for their own political purposes, helped me to think through this juxtaposition in the first place. However, Transitional justice as an institutionalized project in Tunisia, it was not imposed, right, as those institutions Jelena talked about. Rather, the project was indeed heavily shaped by knowledge and ideas introduced by the so-called justice industry. So it was conceived as a holistic project, which at that point in time was kind of the state of the art of transitional justice, bringing different kinds of institutions together, addressing different kinds of grievances from political human rights violations to socioeconomic concerns. And it was encompassing basically everything the so-called transitional justice toolbox had to offer at that time. And there were also lots of trainings on how to do transitional justice in Tunisia. So the lawmaking project was preceded by a so-called national dialogue on transitional justice, where there was like input from civil society organizations in the law drafting process. Civil society organizations were part of the law drafting process, but all of that was accompanied by trainings and workshops and professionals from the so-called justice industry who basically introduced knowledge, ideas, both on a technical level as well as on a substantial level. And so two terms I encountered in my research that describe this Tunisian process were like a laboratory of transitional justice and a model project. And that was also by Tunisian actors who said, like, we're actually interested in developing a model project and following these different kinds of offerings. And different international actors also pushed for having their pet issues included in this project, since Tunisian actors were willing to absorb it. But it also somehow fit the Tunisian context to have such a holistic approach, right? Addressing both political human rights violations and socioeconomic grievances. So in general, what I could see is that the assumption that it was all just imposed top down, that was kind of too easy. So, and that would deny Tunisian political actors some agency. So in general, I would see that this kind of project was very much welcome in Tunisia because, as I would argue, it served the political purposes. And here we are with the political use of all of this, of those in power at that time, because politics could keep a grip on it by having an institutionalized kind of technocratized project. So institutionalized politics could keep a grip on it, but they could also cater to different constituencies with having such a broad mandate and a holistic approach. Therefore, I would argue, or as I do in the book, is that transitional justice has not been political in Tunisia despite being a technocratized project, but rather because of it, because the setup, the design, and also the decision-making structures in the very form it took, it basically, served the political purposes of some political actors who were in power at that time. We also said that we would somehow talk a little bit about research as an ongoing process, and I was accompanying the Transitional Justice project for while it was developing. And what I could see is that there were then also shifting dynamics and configurations between the international and the domestic through shifting domestic politics and power relations as well. Because very early on in the process, domestic political power constellations changed. Those who then, were elected into positions of power, into the government, they were not so much interested in the Transitional Justice Project anymore. And that then somehow forced the international actors to take a more pronounced stance for the Transitional Justice Project and thereby against the government, although their absolute position did not shift, right? And beforehand, they would always say, like, we work with the government, and that suddenly found them in a position where they were kind of working against the government, which made them kind of uncomfortable. And yeah, the last point I want to talk about is transitional justice as a site of struggle. And here I found Oumar's work with which I engaged after I kind of finished the PhD, and which later became the book, but quite insightful to also think about like who uses transitional justice institutions as a political arena, as you call it, and for what purposes and for what audience. And I would say that in Tunisia, there was an interest in keeping up the image of the model project, although there were, quite a lot of internal quarrels, external quarrels, and it was all not going planned. But there was an interest in keeping up the image of the model project, both from the Tunisian actors, who then somehow could still present themselves to international audiences as having set up such a model project, but also from the international actors because, or for some of them, and I was told like mainly UN actors, because they needed to present it as a success, right? Because Tunisia was the model project, the laboratory, and even though there was so many internal and external quarrels, so many things going wrong, so many accusations of corruption and these kind of things, the image of the model project needed to be kept up. There needed to be a final report. The work had to be finished. It needed to be a success. And therefore, also some of the international actors were actually involved in keeping up that image, although domestically there was so much contention around the institution. And this is where I would close for now, because I already went 1 minute over.
Thank you so much. I was so engrossed, I forgot to time you anyway. Thank you so much for those opening remarks. Jelena, would you be happy to go next and respond, and then we'll move to Oumar as well. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to comment on this. I enjoyed Mariam's book and her work over the years. So maybe I'll just very briefly say a few things about more broadly how we can situate Mariam's book within the larger context of where transitional justice literature has moved. And I guess I'm the oldest on the panel by, double the years. So I remember back in the days when transitional justice was considered a novel subfield of inquiry. And I remember many debates in the early 2000s about whether transitional justice even is a field, and then those debates moving into kind of next generation debates about, well, if it is a field, okay, we have established it's a field, does it have a legal bias? Is it because so much of transitional justice scholarship comes out of legal studies, or comes out of human rights, or comes out of international law? So is this why all the prescriptions and suggestions and recommendations and policy prescriptions within transitional justice all focus on some kind of legal remedy? And then that scholarship moved into somewhat tedious debate about effectiveness. And so then you would have hundreds and hundreds of articles, a lot of them quantitatively trying to measure effectiveness of transitional justice mechanisms, but again, understood very legally. So people would measure how many domestic trials you have in a particular country, and then at time 0, and then time 0 plus 10, have human rights improved in that country, and then make some kind of assumptions or conjecture, probably is a more appropriate term, for arguing the more domestic trials you have, the more your democracy has consolidated, or the more there's non-repetition, so fewer human rights abuses. So that took a while to process, and as I said, I found that particularly uninspiring, because I should probably say why instead of just criticizing, because I think the problem with that generation of research is that they assume that having a domestic trial on its own is meaningful, and that's something that we can then extrapolate results from. And as we started to research in more depth, like Mariam has done in her book, what these trials actually look like, and just having a trial on its own is meaningless. It can actually be the opposite of a progressive justice endeavor. It can be a conservative movement to foreclose debates about the past, or it can be a pure issue of legal corruption, or it can be a co-optation of the legal system. So just counting, yes, Argentina had 500 domestic trials, which is amazing, which means so-and-so. I thought subsequent research, a too simplistic way of understanding what happens. Similarly at that time, so now we're like in mid-2000s, I would say, maybe late 2000s, there's been more research on truth commissions, and then another few years passed when people were comparing whether truth commissions were just as good as trials, and then in what ways are they more effective or less effective, and what would be the expectations of truth commissions. And then a lot of research was spent analyzing what are the criteria under which truth commissions are formed, and then what is the political environment in a country that makes it more or less likely to form a truth commission. What's the political context? What are various political bargains that need to be made? And that research became, in my view, slightly more interesting, and because it became more politicized, and it clearly understood politics to be at the root of transitional justice, and not just, you know, how many trials did the country have. And then I think more recently, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a real resurgence, well, not a resurgence, but maybe a insurgence of more critical work on transitional justice that looks at, with a much more critical lens, at the whole spectrum of transitional justice, not just institutions, but also kind of meta critique of transitional justice as a field. And we have a lot of scholars looking at kind of some naive assumptions that were undergirding some of the transitional justice work from the early generations. A critical work looking at whether dealing with the past and accounting for past violations is even a worthy endeavor to begin with. Now, I think it is, so I'm not quite there with some of the more critical scholars, but I think it's certainly an important and worthwhile debate within scholarship that needs to happen. And then also, we see a much broader understanding of what transitional justice is. So finally, we're moving away from just the courtroom and, you know, whether this law was passed and, you know, whether a report was issued or not, into understanding transitional justice to be something much broader that includes reparations, restitution, memorialization, remembrance practices, monumentalization, architecture, building of museums, destroying old museums, textbook reform, education policy reform, financial reparations, all sorts of things that I think should be considered as transitional justice, just as much as the early literature considered a much more discrete number of things. And so as that is happening, I think the core field of transitional justice also has expanded and is now, has the kind of its tentacles into additional disciplines, where it used to be really law, kind of human rights, political science, IR sort of on the fringes. Now, transitional justice is in museum studies, as it's in history, and it's much more firmly rooted, for example, in sociology, in even things like art history, if we considered art restitution as part of transitional justice, for example, and there are people who work on that as well. Maybe getting into economics as well in terms of financial reparations, restitution. And so I think that that's a positive development overall, because it has taken us away from a rather limiting legal straitjacket and allowed us to rethink what dealing with the past really means in a much more holistic and multidisciplinary way. That's it.
Thank you so much. I'm busy writing notes because I think there's going to be lots of really interesting overlapping conversations to come back to. So maybe at this stage we'll go to our final panelists. Oumar, thank you so much for your comments, and then we'll have a wider conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Briony. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to share this panel with Jelena, who has been of a big influence and inspiration on my work since the grad school. And also to Mariam, this is an excellent book that I enjoyed reading because it's so rich. It gives us a lot of understanding of the microprocesses of transitional justice and how it evolved in Tunisia. But at the same time, it does also point to how much the Tunisian experience is similar or look like other transitional justice mechanisms in different settings. And I'll just follow up a bit on what Jelena talked about regarding the critical work on transitional justice and trying to tie that to one of the key themes from the book, which is the performing of transitional justice, how transitional justice performed in Tunisia. And I was glad to see that Mariam did mention that in terms of performance of transitional justice, we should understand two things because the word performance itself has a double meaning. So how it operates, meaning how it performs, implying even some assessment of quality, whether it met the expectations. But the other understanding of performance here is performance as a setting of stage, or as you mentioned in one of your interviewees mentioned, performing as a mise en scène or a theater. So this is a quote from one of your interviewees who were talking about the spatial chambers that look like actual theater. And that's where I want to focus a little bit here. The idea of a lot of transitional justice processes being like a performance, or in other words, an elite compromise of a staging a range of activities that are meant to assuage or to go through processes that would look like they're actually delivering a good, meaning justice or truth or reconciliation or reparation, when in the end, this is actually just that, a performance that does not in the end achieve any of those goals, or at least not at the level that they were anticipated. A few examples that I've noticed in Tunisia, which also very similar to what happened recently in the Gambia, or even over the past 2 weeks in Guinea, where they are holding these trials regarding the 2009 massacres at the stadium. What has become very common in all these instances is the live streaming of these ceremonies or these trials, and like hundreds of thousands of YouTube views, basically, and also, a lot of laughter going on in these processes. Again, the staging of these activities. In Tunisia, for instance, it was very interesting to see that some of these hearings were held at Ben Ali's wife former's house, or at least a property, again, as a way of staging a performance there, even though the Dignity Fund, as you talked about, people were not operational, people who were supposed to be received payments or reparation didn't know what process to go through. The reconciliation law involved some amnesties, and one of the interviewees, I think, also does say that reconciliation was some kind of a whitewashing, which did not involve the testimonies from the perpetrators. So it was the victims that were paraded in some ways in front of the stages to recount what they went through, whereas perpetrators were absent. And that does remind me also some of the testimonies from South Africa, from former victims who, in the end, were very dissatisfied with the transitional justice proceedings. And I have a quote here from one South African mother who had lost a child, and during these testimonies, where she was saying that, quote, "Why is that these perpetrators were given amnesty? The TRC was not fair because these children were not the children of the TRC commissioners. They were our children. We are the parents. When they ask for forgiveness, they should have asked us, the parents, to see if we would accept that or not." But the story is foretold. The performance is already scripted, meaning that one goes, perpetrators goes, and they would confess and they were given amnesty. Or in the case of Tunisia, the perpetrators were not even there to begin with. So, and I will just stop there. I think there is a process going on here, which is similar to other instances, that there's a demand for transitional justice. This demand oftentimes is both local, but also internationally driven from what you call the transitional justice industry. And the demand is also to stage a performance of transitional justice. Now, it doesn't mean that justice isn't achieved in the process. Yes, it is, but I am very interested in that performance aspect of this, and this is, it does resonate from what I've read in what happened in Tunisia to what we've seen also in all the transitional justice processes and also there.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really rich interventions. I don't know, Mariam, does it make sense at this stage to come back to you if there are elements of that you'd like to kind of make an initial response to, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you so much for both of the comments. And I think I just start with Oumar's remark because I just have them fresh in my mind. And yeah, I'm really glad that you highlighted the performance aspect, because and in its double meaning, because I think this is really important, because on the one hand, that the process was actually carried out as it was, although there were so many political challenges to it, I think helps for the process to have some legacy at all, right? Because otherwise it might have been abandoned much earlier, and there couldn't have been not any legacy at all. But then, I mean, with the staging and the performance, that also, I mean, I did some interviews in 2020 via phone and video because of the pandemic, but I also had some conversations recently. I was in Tunisia 2 weeks ago, and people really got bitter because they had the feeling that this performance aspect, it was actually, that was what remained. And although, I mean, Jelena calls it in her book like cracking the past open, right? And people acknowledged this, and that they would say, if we hadn't had these performances, we would still not know, and it would still not be off the public record what has happened, right? But especially since all the more material aspects, they didn't materialize, right? People are not getting any reparations. There's still trials ongoing before the specialized chambers, but nobody expects anything to come out of that. And especially after the coup last year in Tunisia, so the president seized power and basically got rid of parliament and democratic structures that had been built over the last years. Nobody expects any kind of political will to follow up on what has been proposed in terms of structural reforms. And I mean, what I recently heard was also some bitterness with regard to, and now we're making the link to Jelena's intervention, where is transitional justice and what is it actually with regard to projects that are seen as less substantial with and even more performative with regard to like arts project and memorialization projects, for example. So just 2 weeks ago, one of my contacts, one of my interlocutors, she just said like, yeah, I mean, the only thing that is left now is memorialization, and they're probably going to dig up some bones in Tatooine and make an art project out of it. Right, and she said it in a very cynical manner, because it's this like the show must go on. Transitional justice has to go on somehow, right? Because there has been so much effort put into it. But if this is the only thing that you can do, then it maybe rather helps transitional justice as such, and not the people it should actually help. And it also doesn't help a political transition anymore, because yeah, it's basically made devoid of politics and political ambitions. And yeah, so that then maybe also links to what Jelena has said with regard to the different generations of transitional justice research. Yeah, I would definitely also say that I came to the research at a time when transitional justice has already kind of moved from the courtroom. But I would also say that there was, when I started doing the research and over time, there was still little engagement with this questions of how does transitional justice actually deal with the transition part, right? And how does it work in interaction with political processes going on in the country? And I mean, of course, there was your work, but how does the intervention or the policy intervention also influence politics? And I would say in Tunisia, it became a site of struggle because it could actually or what it was set out to actually have an influence on the future phase of the Tunisian state, and an influence on how could participate in political processes. And this is why people were actually, yes, thought at the beginning that it had some teeth, which then later political actors got rid of. But I also, yeah, I'm very happy to see more of that work. And I also think right now that there is an expansion also to not only look at international dimensions with regard to the professionals working in domestic contexts, but also with regard to the international dimensions of conflict, which are addressed more and more. And I mean, I hint at that at the end of the book when I talk about the Truth Commission trying to somehow address the French role, for example, in setting up oppressive state institutions dictatorships could later draw on. But my impression is that this is something we will be talking more about in the next years, maybe.
Thank you, Mariam. I should just say to everyone else in the discussion, feel free to raise your hands or put questions in the chat if you would like to. I'll try and monitor that as our conversations ongoing amongst the panel. We would really love to hear from you and your reflections and also insights from your own work. I mean, in the meantime, I think this question of performativity, I think, is really fascinating. And there's such a lot of established work in, you know, politics and democracy studies around that, but less so in the transitional justice domain, I think. And it does raise all kinds of complicated questions around, I think, you know, agency and audience, which is so important in your book as well, Mariam, and some of the associations with performance I think are interesting in this context, in the context of the comments from the entire panel, because there's an element of performance as being sort of subjective, as being disassociated in some sense from forms of like objective material truth, as being playful perhaps, but as always referring to different kinds of audiences. And I wonder, you know, in the context of thinking about transitional justice and performance, and we can imagine many of these different audiences, some of which are domestic and some international, and some of which will blur across those lines. Like in the context of also this evolution of the field that Jelena has outlined, and this kind of understanding that we're in this kind of globalized norm context, like, do the audience become more powerful than the performers in this sense, like in transitional justice? So I would maybe just throw that back out to the panel. Mariam, you can respond, or Jelena, Oumar as well. But it's something that occurred to me. I was thinking, well, where's the kind of the balance of power here, you know, in that kind of performance? I don't know if someone wants to take that up.
Very spontaneously, I would agree maybe with this assumption. Because resonance is so important, and the question is, with whom do these performances resonate? And I mean, in talking about the public hearings again in Tunisia, which were described to me as the best gain of the Truth Commission, that was definitely also achieved through one thing that Jelena also criticized at the beginning, like reach, basically, how many people did we reach with our performance? So through an accounting logic, but then also through the debates that it stirred, and because it was on the record, right? So nobody could take that away again, because it was broadcast live on television, and that also helped keeping up some momentum. And I would say it also helped in somehow getting the final report, then later published in the official gazette. So that would be the domestic audience and resonance. And then for the international dimension of it, yeah, of course you need the international audience because you also need some financing, right? And you need you need the financing to also set up the infrastructure. And then individual actors involved in the process, they could also draw some social capital out of it, right? Because they would then be invited to speak to other audiences as well about the Tunisian experience. The same happened before, that other actors were invited to speak to Tunisian actors, and so there's this whole circle of like knowledge transfer and so if you keep up the performance as a success story, then of course your experience is more interesting than if your story is perceived as the failure story. Put it like that. That would be my initial thoughts on the question.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question, but just to give Jelena, Oumar an opportunity if they wanted to respond to that topic. Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, maybe just a sentence or so. I mean, yes, there's a huge part of performativity in all of this, and I definitely understand why Mariam's interviews would say, "Oh, great, you know, there's going to be a children's play about this," and so we've solved transitional justice problems through, you know, a high school play about reconciliation and how they would dismiss it, or an art project and all of that, and that's perfectly fair, I think. Certainly, if you are, you know, coming out of a period of violence and somebody's telling you, you know, you only have, you know, if only you could, you know, do a theater play with your former enemies, everything's going to be fine. So I understand the cynicism. My only comment to this is that, you know, things that we consider more serious are also performative. So, you know, court cases are performances. Everything, I mean, Oumar will tell you, everything at the ICC is a performance, from how they look and dress and talk and refer to one another and what language they use and what visuals they present, and the staging of the testimonies and the staging of the graphic violence, and all of that is a performance. And it's performance, you know, the more money you have, the better the production. It's like, you know, it can be a B movie or it can be an A movie, depending on how much money you have to produce it. And so I would just say that, you know, all of these things are performances, and truth commissions are performative. I mean, political action and political behavior is performative. So it's not just literal performing arts on the stage. It's the whole process is, I think, should be understood as part of a performance.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And I mean, this is also what I do. I just, wanted to hint at that specific point that was pointed out recently.
And I'll just add briefly that, there's also some loop going on around, because the performers are also responsive to how the performance is received by the audience. So when there is, for instance, a sense that, there are so many people who are tuning in and watching in the live stream or watching it on TV, that does affect how the operations are carried on. It can, of course, has a positive loop effect, because if the whole world is watching, or if there is a strong sense that the communities themselves are paying a lot of attention about the process, that can guide for more caution about how the process goes and more accountability. Or it could also go the other way around. It can devolve into theater and a lot of laughter with what we've seen recently in Guinea, for instance. So there is potentially some more positive effects or accountability depending on how the audience itself responds to the performance.
Yes, thank you so much, Diane. Do you want to come in now with your question?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That was such a fascinating, really interesting talk. And I've got a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to narrow them down to two. I kind of want to continue that conversation about the audience. I think it is, I fully agree that that's something that's really important in this process of transitional justice. I was wondering, in the case of Tunisia, whether you've kind of witness like a divergence or a convergence in terms of how, say, local audiences perceive this transitional justice process, or how they kind of judge these performances. Because I can imagine, even within the local audience, there might be some kind of tension between how different groups perceive it. And kind of related to that audience question, I was also wondering whether regional kind of audiences also are in the mind of Tunisian transitional process. So in particular, say other kind of Arab Spring countries, or, neighboring countries, other than sort of like the domestic audience and the sort of international community. Are there any like kind of narratives around regional audiences, perhaps? So I feel like that wasn't one question, but another question I think is more of a kind of an open one. But I think Jelena, you've mentioned the sort of the way the literature is being kind of evolved into, talking about the legal kind of framework and human rights issues. So I guess more kind of normative talks around transitional justice, and then, moving on to talking more about the effectiveness of it. I was wondering if there are, in your kind of view, like there are ways to bridge these two, and not just talking about like a legal aspect on one side of the conversation and the just about effectiveness on the other, but rather to kind of bridge those two and talk about both, perhaps, in our studies of transitional justice. Yeah, so those are my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. I mean, so I hadn't explicitly done work just around the question of how does the audience react, right? And I mean, so I was doing fieldwork stretched out over several visits, over several years. So I only have, snapshots basically. But what I can say is that at the beginning, the concern was more with the question of does the commission want to communicate at all, right? Does it want to have an audience at all? Or is it busy with like introspection and internal power sharing struggles and these kind of things? And so there was kind of the accusation that the commission just doesn't want to communicate, and that then kind of changed with the first public hearings actually taking place, because that then explicitly sought a broader audience. But so there was this tension between the commission kind of being not very transparent in their endeavors, but then on the other hand also having to secure victim files basically because of that accounting logic, right? So they had to show that they're doing their job properly, and to justify their existence, they had to make sure that they are collecting many files, and so they had to kind of reach a broader audience. So I think there's a bit of a tension there, and I mean, what I heard is that, of course, things were perceived differently among different people, and that they also provoke different emotions. But I think that's kind of expected. With regard to the regional audience, I mean, I had one interview partner who explicitly said, I mean, with regard to the model project, yeah, we also want to be an example for the region, but that and then also contrasting it with the kind of failed Moroccan experience that wasn't a good example. So but that was not a narrative that I heard very often, right? Yeah, it showed up, but I think things evolved so quickly in the region, and the paths diverged so quickly in the countries of the so-called Arab Spring, that any kind of comparison or similarity that could have been expected was very soon perceived to be unrealistic, and so there might have rather been connections to other places that had similar institutionalized transitional justice projects at kind of the same time, I would say. And we can see people who have been working on Tunisia moving on to other places, Central African Republic, for example, where we can see a bit of similarities in the mandate as well. I'm trying to get into that and see how like thick the connections actually are there, but I haven't digged so deeply into that, but yeah.
Thank you so much. We also have another question in the chat. I don't know if you've been able to see that, Mariam.
Yeah, but there was also a question to Jelena, I think.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Jelena, did you want to come in and respond? I'm sorry.
Briefly, yeah, I mean, when I said that, you know, the early transitional justice was just legal, I don't think there's anything wrong with legal analysis. I think all I was saying is that I don't want it all to be just legal analysis. And it really, when you go back, I mean, so much of this early literature really did come out of law, and an understanding of what is success or what is failure and what is effective and what sequencing and all of that all came out through an analysis of court cases. And then so much ink has been spilled on whether domestic courts are better than international courts or hybrid courts, and what does a hybrid court look like, and the, you know, the issues of international law and how those issues can be translated. And that's all fine. It's just that there's, as the last 20 years have shown, there's just so much going on within countries that are coming out of a period of violence that just may not be captured by a purely legal analysis. Just this thing we talked about in the previous round about performativity and what it is that these courts actually do, and the political context in which they operate, not, you know, things like political corruption or politicization of the court or co-optation, but even just kind of the presentation of evidence and all of that. I think a purely legal focus has often taken for granted without understanding all this other stuff that goes on. A lot has been written on international tribunals and the way in which they operate under different kinds of pressures, and who gets to give a testimony and who doesn't, and how, how do we assess the validity of some of these verdicts if some people could not testify for various reasons, cultural reasons, gender reasons, all sorts of reasons. And I think all of that should be part of the analysis.
Thank you so much. Oumar, did you want to comment on any of that, or? So we can move on to the question in the chat. So about this, some additional kind of clarification, discussion around the lost political dimension in transitional justice, Mariam, that you referred to, and maybe if you'd be able to elaborate a little on what you would mean by that in the context of your work.
Yeah, what I mean by that is that, I mean, I observed this empirically, but I also, to some degree, it mirrors in scholarship that what is happening politically in a context where transitional justice process is taking place is often not taken into account, although a transitional justice process should ease a political transition or make it more just, or this is one of the initial purposes. So I mean, one sentence that I heard at some point, and it was more in passing, but that really stuck with me, was this question of whether something is good for the for transitional justice, right? And that decisions were taken with this question in mind, and not whether something is actually good for politics or for the political transition. So it was rather self-referential. I borrowed that notion of the good project then from Monika Krause, who would also say that basically projects, I think she's working on humanitarian projects, they were mainly, or the main purpose behind them is like doing good projects. And I mean, it kind of resonated with what I saw with regard to transitional justice, that lots of what was happening around it politically and what other institutions were doing was kind of not taken into account. And yeah, a bit of this idea of like mission creep, or like competing mandates, or that the transitional justice institutions and actors, they were more concerned of like how they could basically make sure that the transitional justice project was running as it should be and as it was conceived of them, but not situating it and its purpose within the political context and how it would interact with other things that were happening. So this is what I meant with a lost political dimension, as you called it. I don't know whether I used that term. Yeah.
Maybe just piggybacking on that response, I think kind of tapping into the international domestic element, the way in which you then describe that kind of political dimension made me wonder whether that can help elaborate some of the nuances of that interaction between what we might think of as domestic and what we might think of as international, both in terms of actors and also in terms of audience, because often the kind of problematic assumption is that transitional justice is primarily conceived of based on kind of internationalized norms and mechanisms, and the domestic space is one that you almost needs to be conquered in order to generate enough acceptance and implementation, and that you know, local domestic politicians, for example, are only interested in X, Y, and Z and will kind of manipulate around transitional justice processes. And so does this kind of, the way in which you wanted to describe and bring back in that political dimension, does that elaborate or illuminate something around that international domestic dynamic for you in the context of Tunisia, or for the panelists in context of other you know, places and spaces you've worked in?
Yeah, in that regard, what I also tried to hint at in my opening remarks is that I mean, I'm generalizing now, but a generalizing assumption would be, so international actors bringing in toolbox and templates and imposing them top down, introducing institutionalized projects, that this would necessarily be depoliticizing and kind of going against the interest of domestic political actors. And I mean, as I said, I'm generalizing. And there I would say, well, there were some domestic political interests to exactly have such a project, because it would serve their purposes, to have a transitional justice ministry, to have a law, to have these institutions established through the law that would then allow also to have such a broad project and to cater to different audiences, to make promises also about reparations to different constituencies, and to actually have like a broad possible populations of victims. And so in that regard, it fit well together. I mean, so I initially asked Habib Nassar to join us, who had worked for ICTJ as the MENA person at that point in time, or at the beginning of the Tunisian transitional justice process. He couldn't make it, but I know that Habib, for example, he would be much more, or he would be more critical than I am with regard to how much space the internationals took and how much they left for domestic agency. But that might also be due to the different points in time when he was basically doing his work and when I was doing my research, because what I was seeing is that so also Tunisian civil society basically told me, especially with regard to ICTJ, which is often very much criticized, that they were rather supporting them in their endeavors, and also helping then somehow to preserve the project against the government, right, to some degree. But that also has something to do with when are you talking to people and when are you looking at something. And so I think we have to take both narratives seriously. And
thank you. Maybe because I see the time, we've got one more question in the chat. I wonder if, Mariam, you'd be happy to respond to the question in the chat, and then I'd give each of the panelists a minute to sort of make some closing remarks.
Did it transform the standard toolbox? Thanks for the question. I mean, so I think in the literature, toolbox and templates are sometimes used kind of interchangeably, and I would say that a template you rather use it as it is, and in the toolbox you can choose different tools and pick from them. And I would say in Tunisia we could somehow see a mixture of both, because we could see almost all the tools in the toolbox somehow being included, right? And I mean, so, but it was kind of following a model approach of or model template of a holistic approach, because you had I mean, a truth commission, specialized chambers, a reparations fund, provisions for institutional reform. So you have these different institutional measures that should be taken, and then also socioeconomic concerns next to political human rights violations. So the holistic approach basically was mirrored very much in the law. And what I heard from my interview partners is that there were also different international actors who were more concerned with one tool or the other, and so they tried to make sure that all of them actually made it in there. I mean, I don't know what exactly you mean with the transforming standard tools in the toolbox, but there were definitely some accents or some things that were developed, and that is, for example, like the strong focus also on socioeconomic aspects, and the option of having regional victims or région victime, so that not only individuals could become victims, but under the law basically, but also entire regions, which kind of added collective dimension or the acknowledgement of collective marginalization to the standard toolbox, which haven't been there before. And then, I mean, the strong focus on dignity, which is kind of linked to that, right? And I mean, what I heard a few times is that Tunisia didn't want to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because reconciliation is such a Christian notion. And then the other justification would be, I mean, dignity was actually such a strong demand within the revolution, and it kind of reconciles both political and socioeconomic demands, and so it was central to have it in there. And I mean, at the last International Studies Association annual convention, I was at a transitional justice panel where at some point one of the panelists said something like, oh yeah, great, Tunisia gave us dignity, so we have a new thing in transitional justice. And I was a bit like, okay, now Tunisia gave you dignity. That's interesting to see how this is being picked up in the future as something that is new and a new tool or approach. But I can't speak to that now, how this is going to be picked up or not. And what to make of such a framing, I also can't talk about that now. But I think it's worthy of discussion about thinking, like what context, how to talk about what context give us as researchers and field.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. We'll have to organize another event to discuss that. Jelena, would you like to make any closing remarks or any thoughts on the conversation?
Nothing too long or specific. I just want to congratulate Mariam on a great book that I think is a very welcome contribution to these debates and shows specifically how this literature is moving and where it's going. And hopefully in 5 years we'll have another panel where she as a senior scholar will have other junior scholars talk about how much they've been inspired by her work. So I'm sure that's on the horizon.
Thank you. Oumar, would you like to make any closing remarks?
Yeah, again, thank you and congratulations to Mariam. This is such a great book, and there is so many takeaways from this study. One of the takeaways for me is when you discuss the idea that transitional justice needs a window of opportunity, or revolutionary window of opportunity, as you called it in the case of Tunisia. And that got me wondering whether there is also a need for a window of opportunity from the international community, so an international window of opportunity, and whether those two windows of opportunity, the domestic and the international one, need to somehow overlap for justice to come out of this process or not. I'll stop there. Again, thank you and congratulations.
Thank you so much. Mariam, sorry, did you want to respond?
No, I also just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us in the discussion. But I didn't want to take over your job of closing the panel.
No, I'm happy to share it around. But thank you so much. Yeah, congratulations also from me, Mariam. I very much enjoyed reading your book and citing it everywhere I can. Thank you for the really engaging discussion. Thank you so much, Jelena and Oumar as well, for joining us and adding your thoughts and reflections. One of the focus areas of WICID is peace, conflict and justice. And so please do keep an eye out for other similar events that we might be holding. And huge thanks to Mariam for agreeing to discuss her book as part of our events series. Thanks also again to Diane for all of her work organising the session. And thanks finally, of course, to the great questions coming from the audience. So I wish you all a wonderful continuation of your day or start of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.